Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, armed governmental personal protection operations, and indeed the real area, which is geopolitics, the world in which we all live in. But too often, we kind of don't see the bigger picture. So the show basically is designed to give that bigger picture, regardless of what we do and the guests, regardless of whom they are and what area they work in, and just sometimes see the synergies between their world and the secret world. Well, today we've actually going back more into the secret world. We've had on sportsmen, we've had on actors and directors, etc. But now we're going back into a more obvious connection with the secret world of intelligence, national security. And we've got a fantastic guest on today. And the reason why I paused for one quick second there was that I'm actually quite excited because the guests we've got on, I've been trying to get somebody from the RAF forever and a day. And I finally got someone of great interest that's had an international connection. His name is Frasier. I'm going to let him introduce himself, and then I'm going to let him talk about what his upbringing was and how he actually got into the RAF, which I know is interesting for many, many people because a lot of people want to follow that path. And then we're going to go into some of the sexy stuff that he did. So, Frasier, thank you very much for coming on the show, my friend.
Good morning, Carlton. How are you?
I'm very, very well, thank you. And basically what I'd like you to do for the guests is introduce yourself. Tell them who you are and where you came from.
My name's Frasier Mitchell. I am now some 17 years retired from the Royal Air Force. I was an officer flying on, first of all, going through the training system and then flying on Hercules, and then for the predominance of my career on Mk2 Maritime Nimrods.
So when you say Mark II, how did the Mark II differ from the Mark I? Was there a vast difference?
Yeah, the Nimrod is an aircraft, and I have to profess to being slightly biased because I've had a big love affair with the aircraft. Was essentially the Mark I was a reboot of the Comet, the famous first jet airliner,
yep,
which replaced the Shackleton. So the Mark I Nimrod was a groundbreaking aircraft in many ways, and the Mark II was an update on that. Which took it to again, it kept it at the forefront of maritime patrol and attack.
Oh, that's interesting. So we had an aircraft comparable to the American or superior? What would you say on
that? Contentious question. The Americans throughout my career were flying the Orion, the Lockheed Orion P3, which is essentially like a Hercules with the wings on the underside.
Yeah.
And they had they had some exceptional crews, they had some exceptional kit, but obviously not to my dying breath would I admit that we were ever less than the premier maritime force with the Nimrod.
Right. Okay. So I like to hear that. Nice one. So now the other thing that quite interests me, but I do want to go back into your background, you growing up in the likes. But before we hit that, I just wanted to kind of find out why the Royal Air Force and not the Royal Navy doing the maritime work.
That's a good question. I like that. I think we can blame an air show at Cottesmore. This must have been early 70s. I can remember the excitement for the, I think it was General Dynamics F-111, the first so-called swing wing aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw the Harrier at that air show. And crucially, during our wander around the many stalls and stands, some cheeky chappie in a flying suit convinced my father that he could part with the grand total of 50 pence for a inch square Polaroid of me and my brother sat in a Hunter. After the ensuing sort of squabble about who was going to wear the bone dome in the cockpit, I got it. And I can still remember my father's amazement that this thing was going to cost him 50p, but I still have that picture. And that's really what I looked around and thought, well, if I can do this for a living, this looks fun, actually. We'll have a go at this. And that was really the seed sown, I'm afraid.
Right. So did you know you were going maritime when you went into the Air Force, or did you think that it would be more sort of, excuse my ignorance, because I'm thinking that if it's maritime, surely the Air Force, the Navy says, I want that area because that's me. I've got interoperability with my ships and subs or whatever it might be, much closer than if we have the Air Force doing it. So I'm just wondering, did you think maritime, or did you think I'll go Royal Air Force and I'll be flying around doing whatever the Air Force does, rather than what you are specific to the naval aspect?
No, not really. I wanted to fly Harriers, but was not good enough. I had difficulty through flying training, so I originally joined as a pilot and had enormous problems instrument flying. So eventually, I was withdrawn from the system, and as with most pilots who then are unable to proceed through flying training, then went to be a navigator. Again, against stiff competition, I then essentially went multi-engined transport, which is, again, not what I wanted to do at all. Mm-hmm. So having had two fairly serious setbacks, I was then hell-bent on getting involved with something that actually did get back into what I considered to be a more operational, cutting-edge, sensors and weapons-based area. Not that I didn't enjoy the tours on the other aircraft, but Nimrods have a certain... I don't think anybody really understands them. If you mention a Nimrod to people, all they think of is the ridiculous Mark III thing that we tried to make an AWACS out of.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking of.
The nose and tail.
Yeah.
So everybody has a giggle, recalls that sort of fairly elephant-like structure, and then kind of veers off into, after the laughter subsided, everybody's forgotten what they were talking about. So, which is probably a good thing given the multitude of roles that Nimrods undertook.
Right. So in effect, you weren't just maritime. You could have done other roles within the Nimrod. Hence the Royal Air Force doing it rather than the Navy.
Yeah, I mean, again, the Navy, you either the Navy's was at the time either Harriers or helicopters.
Gotcha.
My brush with the Lynx Force. There are several times throughout my life when I've sort of bumped into other uniformed forces that I thought, well, maybe I chose the wrong colour. Certainly, my involvement with the guys from Poole in maritime counter-terrorism, that really did open my eyes and think maybe I hadn't got the right colour, maybe I hadn't made the right choice, maybe I fitted it better somewhere else. But I guess we can all say that.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So that's a great segue, actually, for us to get into your early childhood and what brought you into other than the 50 pence, of course, what brought you into
50p, bless him.
Absolutely. What brought you into the
a lot of
military
money
at all? You know, why the military?
Again, I think it was there were a number of steps that had to be taken to kind of get me where I wanted to go. When I first applied, having got over the discussion about whether or not the military, I thought, no, that does look like something I really want to do. I think the number of steps at the time when I applied, you had to be a commissioned officer as pilot or navigator, mm-hmm. because they couldn't trust non-commissioned officers with nuclear weapons or some such nonsense, which you'll have a giggle at, because obviously it's all a bit well, anyway, those are the rules at the time. And so my path to get where I wanted to go was largely mapped out because of what was and was not allowed. Why the Air Force? Because my dad had told me again, I wanted to join the Scouts, and he said, why would you join the Scouts when you can go shooting and flying with the Air Training Corps? So go and have a look at that. You might get more out of it. And he was right, actually. The ATC was just fantastic.
Was your dad connected to the military before, or your grandpa?
No, although good question, excellent question. His father had told him when he left school that under no circumstances would he join the military, because what my father really wanted to do was throw Sea Furies off carriers. Right. And his father had told him he'd get a proper job and he'd go to university. And I think my father always had a bit of a lantern, held a bit of a candle for that, if you like, if that's the right phrase.
Yeah.
And when I came to leave sixth form, I had offers on the table to go and do amazing to me now, really, electronic and electrical engineering. That would have been the death of me. In Imperial College in London, or UMIST in Manchester.
Well, I'll tell you, Imperial College and UMIST, very, very good unis, both of them.
Oh, absolutely. I think that they were better off without having had a brush with me, to be honest, Carlton. So I looked at that, and then at that point, I had applied and gone through Biggin Hill and all the aptitude tests and everything else, and I'd heard nothing back. So my dad said, "Well, what have you got to lose? Make a quick phone call, see if there's anything happening." So I rang them up, and they said, "Oh yeah, didn't you?" This was in the September, October of '85, and they said the guy on the other end of the phone sort of went quiet. He said, "Oh, you haven't got a letter then?" I said, well, no, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be ringing. He said, "Oh, what are you doing on 5th of January 1986? And I said, "Well, I don't know. You tell me." He said, "Well, you've been accepted to start training at Cranwell before you then go on to flying training." So Incredible. That was a bit of a bombshell. And then I went to my dad and said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Well, look, if you cock up the flying part of it, you can always then go back to university. So go and have a go."
Brilliant. So, I mean, obviously, people might not understand, but especially American listeners, I've got quite a few over there, is that the Royal Air Force is quite difficult to get in as a pilot for the pure and simple reason there's many people going after very, very few positions in relation to somewhere like the United States, where they've obviously got 3 forces where they have pilots. In fact, 4 if you count the US
Marine Corps.
I'm thinking Marine Corps, I'm thinking Air Force, Navy, and then obviously I was also thinking in fact 5, because you've got Customs who fly aircraft, and you've also got then the Coast Guard. So they've got a whole plethora of people where you can go and fly in uniform for your country, whereas really ours is quite tight, isn't it? It's the Army, the Air Force and the Navy. I guess the Army doing helicopters. But it's difficult to get in, isn't it? It's really difficult. They're cutting people away rather than bringing people in. Is that right, me saying that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of... essentially, that's absolutely on the money, Carlton. There is stiff competition. That competition doesn't stop throughout your career. So getting selected is half the battle. I mean, you will know this. Whenever you celebrate your success for the few hours that it lasts when you've completed something, that's short-lived, because you're then at the bottom of the next hill to climb. So there's never not a challenge. It's an ongoing process. There's no rest easy. There's always training to be better, drilling to be better. So yeah, it's not easy to get in, and certainly even once you're in, then I don't think you're necessarily secure. Although obviously they do try and look after you, but I don't think that's a bad thing. No, you're only as good as your last mission. You really need to keep sharp and be pulling your weight. And if you're not, anybody who sits back and relaxes stands out like a sore thumb, really.
Well, the reason I mentioned that was because you said in the beginning you failed to be a pilot. Well, I'm not seeing it as failure, because I think that where you probably were, and you can explain this to listeners actually how you failed, but
sure,
you may well have got in forces that had a much bigger need for pilots, and that's why I'm saying they were cutting people away. So they're looking for excuses not to employ you as a pilot, really, aren't they?
I have to say, if there's ever ever I come across an issue, my first port of call is to sort of self-debrief and say, and to look at me before I look anywhere else to. Perhaps not apportion blame as such, but to sort of say, okay, what went wrong there? The first place I've got to look, I always look at me.
Absolutely right, yeah.
At the point where I'm satisfied it's not, then I'll spread my search. But other than that, I think ultimately, I look back, and certainly my flying career was, the pilot training was one of contrasts. We used to do something called UPs. This is unusual positions. So the instructor in the aircraft to put the aircraft nose up, inverted, shut the throttles, and then you, with just your head on the instruments, so you're not looking outside, would have to recover the aircraft to straight and level flight as fast as possible. Right. Now, certainly on my sort of last few trips, the instructor had to keep a sharp eye on me because he genuinely thought I was cheating in some way, but couldn't work out how. That part, no problem at all. The instinctive part, no problem at all. I seem to be able to master that very quickly. It just happened to be in my makeup. However, I used to get something called the leans, which is where if the aircraft starts to bank very gently and your ears don't pick it up, your canals, right, then you correct it. Then you're banking left, let's say, but your ears haven't sensed that you're banking left. Then you then correct it to go straight and level, but your ears then tell you that you're banking right. So your senses are fighting what you see, and that takes time to overcome, which I now have. But there wasn't enough time in the system to allow me to overcome that, which is, so I hold my hand up. But at the end of the day, on that particular score, I wasn't good enough, and I'm not sure I still have accepted that, but it's been a big feature of my life that. The one thing I really wanted to do was throw Harriers around, and I've got friends who've done that, and they are superior in terms of their level of skill. Right, and that's just the way it is, isn't it? It's just the way that particular part of my life went.
I guess what I'm trying to get to, that doesn't mean I don't believe that you can't or couldn't fly. It just means that you can't or couldn't fly those aircraft at the highest level. Because I guess you will say yes, but I'm saying that the RAF pilots are amongst the best in the world.
Absolutely. Pilots, navs, I say navigators, there aren't any anymore. There are now weapons systems officers, which grates a little bit. But they are. They are by definition of the, I guess, the scenarios we get involved in, the level of expenditure on kit, or the kind of the way some of the kit just happens to turn out through the procurement process means that you've got to be sharp, because you're usually, certainly in the older aircraft, you're carrying a few snags all the time. Mm-hmm. And certainly in the new aircraft, then you're trying to overcome and get the beast shaken down into shape so you can use it as a system. So there's no doubt, to my knowledge, that it's the finest flying training in the world. Last few years after I left the Air Force, I worked with a friend of mine that I joined up with on the same intake, 92 initial officer training, and he left having spent some time on Sea Harriers. So you could shave with the man. He's so sharp. Right. And he did a contract consulting with me as part of the maritime side on flying training to restream the whole system to make it more efficient. Mm-hmm. And looking at it, I do think we have, nothing's perfect, but it's certainly it's one of the best, most comprehensive training systems you will find anywhere.
Now, what I'm not saying is, of course, is because the training is excellent, doesn't necessarily mean that our warfighting capacity is greater than, or indeed in some ways less than, others. It just means that the training is great, because at the end of the day, the military is about, and all forces generally, about what capacity you can have in the round. So you've got to have the equipment, number one. You've got to have all the technologies and techniques and capabilities behind that equipment. And obviously, if you're going to spend $1 trillion a year, you're probably going to have better capacity when you put it in the round. But all I'm saying is that our actual people doing the job are very, very well trained. I think that's the way I'd put that. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with that. Certainly, given our defence spending and the level to which we're trained, certainly I would argue that our guys, and I would say any of them, air, sea, land, amphibious, wherever you want to place your coloured hat, but that whether they're dark green Royal Marines or Army, or the bottom line here is that they think for themselves. They know about their environment. They're sharp operators. They are taught to think about what they're doing. There are other force structures, I think, that are very much a officer says do, those beneath do. Certainly working on a crew of a Nimrod where there are 5 officers and 8 senior NCOs, there is a rank structure because there has to be, but once you're in the air, you're an operator working as part of a team. And that level of thinking, especially when things go wrong, I think that's the key to it, isn't it? When things go right, there's no difference between most of the forces. It's what happens when it doesn't go right. And being in the world you've been in, you'll know that more often than not, it doesn't always go right.
Absolutely.
And more importantly, that most of the stuff that doesn't go right, if you offered it as a film script, you'd be told it was too far-fetched.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting. The only reason I'm bringing that up is because of obviously the situation we've got now within the Ukraine. Obviously, it's just one of many wars that are going on.
Sure.
Presently, but you could see how the basic conscript, it would appear, in the Russian military was not. Let's rephrase. I'm not going to say it was not capable. That'd be wrong. Capability would be wrong.
They haven't got the full picture.
They haven't got the full picture. The capability is wrong because I think they're capable. It's just that there's a lot of things that go with that, isn't there? A lot of things about understanding, even down to as simple a thing as I can imagine for many. Why are we attacking brother Slavs? They've probably got cousins, vast majority of them, sitting in the Ukraine. So you can see how that in itself can play into morale and the way things are.
I will confess to you now, never have I been more upset and confused at what is going on in the world than I am with the current Ukraine situation. There is no single aspect of it that represents progress, a win, development. It's just we're back. We seem to have lost. Well, we seem to have lost humanity, I think, to a degree, and we certainly don't seem as a planet to have learned anything, because this sort of action isn't rational. It's not reconcilable with any irrational objectives, and therefore, unfortunately, whether we like to think old school Cold War, you can't beat fire with anything other than fire, or strength with strength, and that in itself, as you'll know, just takes us into a whole realm of escalation. And what will somebody who shouldn't have done that in the first place do to get out of the problem?
Well, it's very dangerous. There's a little
you'll understand the subtleties of it way more than I will. There's a little bit of daylight
between me and you on this specific one, because obviously there's wars going on all over the place. I mean, top of my head, we could talk about Yemen, we could talk about Congo, we could talk about all over the place. So that's just that aspect, and some of them are far more deadly. We could even talk about non-wars, which have results that take Mexico is a fine example, where we will come to later, because I know you've been involved further down the Central American stream. So you can see how that in itself rolls. When you start figuring out, you talk about 30,000 people, 40,000 a year being bumped off there. And there is no civilian perspective to it in any way, shape, or means. Some people are just killing whole families outright.
Yeah, there's no difference.
There is no difference. So what I'm seeing, because I'm seeing that bigger picture, I'm seeing the Ukraine within line with that. And I also kind of understand the perspective of, I don't understand the actual attacks. I thought the attack was absolutely miscalculated. But I could see why Putin would turn around and say, we were communists in the Cold War, and that's why NATO was created. Great, whatever. Right? Now we're capitalist, supposedly not in a Cold War, and it's doubled its size and it's sitting on my border, right? And increasing all the time. And the Ukraine was the last step for him. I could see that. Now, the big problem for him is, from my perspective, is that you should never, you can argue we're going to take some action, you can put the threat out, but to actually do the action, I just think it's totally and utterly counterproductive for him. And I think that is counterproductive in Russia. Never mind amongst the Russian people now I'm talking about. Never mind anything else. So he's miscalculated, I believe. That's my belief.
I think the news, current events, and I was speaking to my 16-year-old brackets going on 35 daughter, who obviously has a very different perspective on this, and occasionally ask for answers on why is this happening, why is that happening. And I look at her and say, well, genuinely, you go into the geopolitics of it, it'll give you some insight, but really, there's an element of madness and pride and bravado that just
absolutely, it's fine with that, no doubt about that.
Nothing's gonna, what would you do, Dad? Well, I don't know. It's you're getting older when your kids are asking you for answers to problems that you can't give. The Middle East, like you say, Yemen, Mexico. It's just, it's really quite overwhelming at times, and most of them are interlinked in some way. And it's unscrambling that spaghetti, I think, which is an impossible task. It's so the world is a complicated place. Is the biggest understatement, isn't it?
Let's get back to the young man who's now just joined the RAF. So Frasier Mitchell's there. You've got the rank. You've come out of, you've been successful. You're now a navigator in those old days. What happens next?
There were 3 or 4 considered sharper guys in my intake, so they got their choice as to where they wanted to go, and they went Nimrods. I looked.
Please, can you just explain that? Because, again, for people listening, there might be somebody, and I know they're weapons officers now, not navigators or whatever, but there might be somebody who wants to join the RAF. Can you explain how the whole process of choice comes through first, and then go into what you did, please?
Obviously, you get a group of guys. There's going to be a sort of pecking order in terms of skill, capacity, capability. Some are going to be at the top of the pile. Some of them are going to be further down. There's also the sort of classic case of bums on seats. What does the military actually need? And what happens is they balance these 2 factors off, plus a few other instructor inputs to say where people go, what aircraft type they go to. Now, the Nimrod, certainly throughout its career, I think was considered almost a Group 1 posting. What do I mean by that? Group 1 was all the fast jets. So the sharpest talent went to the fast jets, except for the fact that actually operating as a tactical navigator on a Nimrod, you're working with basically 12 other players, multiple sensors. You've got a weapons bay full of hardware. You've got an awful lot to consider. So it was considered, and I think rightly, a significant stretch. It's a demanding role, as just the maritime role, but that particular post on that particular aircraft was, it was certainly before the aircraft was lost. It was incredibly demanding. Right. So the 3 guys before me got the Nimrod post. I went to Hercules for my first 3 years, which didn't impress. And while I had a lovely time, it wasn't what I wanted to do at all.
Why does it not impress, Fraser? Because again, I'm trying to explain to the listeners. What
really? Because
what's your officer grade? So you're an officer. What's your grade?
I was a flying officer.
So you're a flying officer. So that's great already. You've got the uniform. You're the flying officer. You're in command of various men and women, presumably.
Very rarely actually at that point, because you're just part of the crew.
Right.
And as a flying, as an aviator, then you generally don't get involved with the admin of other people's lives. Your principal role is to train and get match fit, as it were. So you come out of the OCU, the operational conversion unit, which trains you on type, and then after that you come out of there with a inexperienced operational category, and the main goal, your only goal at that point, is to become operations ready, basically, a CAT operator, which is an average. You just need to be average but competent.
So that's why you're saying that rank really is immaterial, because you're just actually getting yourself right, never mind anybody else.
Yeah, you're an operator first and foremost. Everything else is just part and parcel of that particular role.
Yeah, understood. So you get Hercules, and you're obviously helping move troops around or equipment around, whatever. But that's not seen as tier one because it's not sexy, or because what?
Well, my perception, well, it just wasn't what I wanted to do. So maybe I had a bit of a jaundiced view of it. Now, going through it, I have to say, looking back, it meant that I got to, the things I got to do were fantastic. And at the time, it's a transport aircraft. It does straight lines. We all know that. But at the end of the day, it had very few navigational aids on it. And certainly people talk about GPS on their phones these days. I was having a laugh with one of my kids the other day who, you know how modern kids are. If they don't have a mobile phone, they don't seem to be able to operate. So I was having a giggle about somebody being in a certain place at a certain time, and I didn't need a phone call. So what was the problem? And I said, well, I don't get it. So I said, well, if we can pitch up in the middle of the South Atlantic at a certain time and lat long and altitude, ready to either receive or give fuel without talking to anybody on a radio, why do you need a mobile phone? Just to meet me at McDonald's or whatever it was. I can't remember.
Brilliant.
And that's an alien concept. But at the time, without GPS, precision navigation was, well, it still is an art form. I'm proud to have been a nav rather than a weapons systems operator, because we were literally taught from first principles. We used to be able to use a sextant to get position lines from stars.
Right. So you could have been on board ship and do that.
It's the same principle, Carlton, but it's just one of those things where certainly before I left, I did some instructional work and as part of a squadron training team. And we'd start to get guys coming through that, GPS systems occasionally can lie to you. Not so much now, but certainly end of the 90s. The GPS would sit there and say it was okay, and I'd know full well that the position was out, significantly out. But if you don't know where the sun should be and what your compasses should be reading, systems can lie to you, and the unwary and perhaps the guys that hadn't got that depth of knowledge about how they worked, I think it potentially could have been put at risk.
Right, interesting. Yeah. So you've got this.
Compasses are 60 degrees apart, and you're heading west, and the sun's not in front of you at night time. You're not heading west.
Yeah. Well, most people wouldn't know that, would they?
Well, this is true, but again, one of my kids sort of likes the stars. Well, there are some real gifts up there. It's just few people know how to exploit them.
Yeah, brilliant. So we've got this. So we've got you on the Herc, and so you don't really want the Herc. How do you then go about getting something else?
I fought to go back to pilot training, and on the basis that I didn't feel at the time, having raised concerns about my instrument flying, I didn't feel at the time that I was given a fair crack. So I kind of had a bit of a fight, that which lasted about a year, and ultimately I was told it's not happening.
Right. So
I then said, well, as far as I'm concerned, well, I'm more than good enough to do something a bit more exciting. My flying categories are climbed right up. I've got the experience. I've been around the world operating in, everything from sort of northern Canada, where there are no airfields, to the desert. We spent some time behind enemy lines in the desert in Iraq. So I'd had a good time of it. And I just wanted to do something else. So at that point, it was, what else can I do, please? If you won't let me go back to pilot training, really, I don't see a future in transport navigation, because GPS is getting better. They don't need navigators. What can I do?
Yeah.
And I was given a series of choices, but ultimately the fastest route I could get to do something was to stay multi-engined and go to Nimrods, which is what I wanted to do. So I did a few courses, and then off I went down to St Morgan in the, it was Halloween actually, 31st of October, 1991.
Yeah.
I went down to RAF Cornwall and started my OCU, which is fantastic.
And this is where you grew, is it? This is where you found yourself, this is what I really wanted.
Yeah, so suddenly I'm not just, shuffling papers in the back of an aircraft. I'm actually involved with crew members' sensors, dropping sonobuoys, practicing attacks, using the basic sensors to create a knowledge of a picture, surface and air, and then to be able to operate and achieve an aim within that, which is, it was always exciting. And don't get me wrong, there were many happy hours of sitting there waiting for something to happen on a search or a patrol. Equally, when it did kick off, it was absolutely mental for the first few seconds while everybody got a grip.
Yeah.
But exciting stuff. A number of things have happened where you think this is just, you'd sit there 20 seconds into the contact and think this is newspaper worthy stuff. It was brilliant.
Now, I don't know if you can say, because you're saying 1991, so the Cold War's come to an end. In terms of what we know,
it didn't.
Yeah, in terms of what we know about the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and communism, in terms of that. But of course, you've still got powerful countries which are potential enemies. And of course, I know that what happened then, in addition to that, was that various services looked around to what else can we aid with.
Oh God, yes. Yeah.
And so they were looking to make themselves relevant. So we're going to come on to one of the areas which got that relevancy a little bit later on. I'm conscious of time. But I just want to say, with the Nimrod, with its military role, its full military role, what are you actually doing then? Because it's not the joint Soviet submarine fleet or naval fleet. What's happening?
Well, at that point, we say Cold War was over. At that point, there's a degree of confusion because some of these things are still sailing. It's just activities dropped.
Yeah.
So we'll remember the Kursk.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The Oscar II class SSGN that foundered through an internal fire. We would still be having exercises, and indeed on one particular occasion, somewhere between Scotland and Iceland, we took over from another aircraft because the Russians would still sail and monitor our exercises.
Yeah.
With a view to, okay, we've now got the surface plot. Could we or could we not put in an attack? So I happened to drop in as the oncoming patrol aircraft, and within about, I think, 12, 15 minutes, we picked up a contact on a buoy, and yes, it was an Oscar class, and yes, it was accelerating away from somewhere between 4 knots up through 18 to 30 knots, and we tracked it for 6 hours, which was absolutely fantastic. I used to work with a guy called Colin, whose acoustic reports were just incredible. We tracked it, and then I think we handed it over to an American, bless them. And I do love the US Navy, but they lost it in 7 minutes, which hurt.
Okay.
That really did. I went down the back into the galley and just sat with a coffee quietly for about a quarter of an hour while people came and laid flowers at my feet. No, it was just disappointing. But what's happening at that point? Really, the Nimrod force is looking to get involved in support for other things, to, like you say, assert its relevance.
Yeah.
Although again, one can argue, I think rightly, that no island nation should be without a high-speed, high-endurance fixed-wing platform. There's just no substitute for it. So it was always going to be relevant. But yeah, then we got into working with other areas and joint force operations and things like that. So we got into working with the Americans with their counter-narcotics in the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic.
And we've got to it. So let's run into that particular area, because having taken a minister down to Colombia and having done some work around that myself, and having And I always think before I say things, Fraser, we're clear about what we can and we can't say, and the show, respects that always. But let's just keep it on the open. So having seen how narcotics move from one side to the other, and this is as I stress, having been working with a minister down there, and then going up to the US end and where the US connections were, and seeing that whole sea run through the Caribbean, through Central America, those fast cigar boats that they used to use.
Go fast.
Absolutely. Even a submarine, which they had. The commander of the Colombian naval base showed me a sub which they'd created and made. This is the narco guys I'm talking about, which they'd filled with coke and moved across. And obviously it had done several trips before they got to it. And then even there was so much money involved that they'd made several of these and they could just dump them if it went wrong. The money's just tremendous.
Well, that's the issue, isn't it? The number of, when you consider, we were looking at the boats they were using, and looking at the sort of technology, which wasn't particularly clever. But at the end of the day, it's all disposable. Once you look at their bottom line, Learjet disposable, Go Fast disposable.
This is what I wanted to speak to you about, because just keep setting that picture. I just want you to explain how the UK was assisting in the prevention of that movement, basically into the US. And obviously you'd be looking at UK Caribbean countries, which were, which still are overseas territories and connected, or are part of the joint working capacity with the UK because of former imperial possessions or colonial possessions, whatever terminology you want to use. So it'd be interesting to see how you fix that all together with the United States, and obviously bigger partners like Colombia, further down south or wherever.
The essential nature of the work was coordination and partnership. So if there were things coming from west to east across the Atlantic, and there were quite a few of those, then we would operate jointly with the US, and they would hand it over to us, and then we take action in our jurisdiction, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
But it ostensibly going across to the west side of the Atlantic. This goes back to kit and capability. The Americans were operating P3s for both their US Navy and their Coast Guard. Here's the boring bit with ANAPS 115 and 137 radars, which were not as good as the search water on the Nimrod. Now,
right, interesting.
You can argue the toss. Ultimately, if you're looking for something, you've got to understand how it functions, how it works, what the crews think, what the technical capabilities are. And ultimately, we were anti-submarine force, and the rationale was, well, it's something small on the surface. What if you can find a submarine mast or an aerial? Why can't you find that? Well, the essential difference is a whip aerial or a mast attached to a very large body of metal below the water is quite stable relative to the surface. Mm-hmm. Your Go Fast is part of the surface noise. The only thing you'll see is wake on a radar, because it kicks up the water. Yeah. But again, you can go into the sort of spectral analysis of, can you see it? Can you hear it? Is it?
I was going to say, could you not have sonar on it, because
you can. Noise. You can, but you've got to be very specific. I could bore you to death, having written a paper on the sort of spectral analysis of Go Fast, if you will, to say, well, how do you find them? And more importantly, I think for about $6,000 US at the time, I could pretty much make one completely invisible. To sensors, which I did a bit of writing on that. Strangely enough, it disappeared from my hard drive quite smartly. But ultimately, we were quite successful finding these things. But again, massive expanse of ocean. Yeah, they are tiny, and really, unless they're doing high speed, we had limited success. But it was, I guess, the real success of it was partnership and presence, and therefore deterrence. Yes. If they don't know what you're doing or where you are, they've got to think twice about how they operate. Well, sometimes that's just good enough. It's a mission kill rather than a hard kill.
Did they not have specific routes? Because I was kind of shown some routes, but I guess my concept of ocean wasn't great. So you may have routes, but does that mean that you actually have a size consideration in terms of those routes? Because I guess
I mean, we were always told, we were always given intel, so we'd be given a patrol area and a rough direction, a threat direction, if you like. So we'd start looking for something as though we were looking for a particular vessel type or a particular pattern of activity.
Yeah.
Because very often you'd have a mothership, or you'd have vessels meeting with one another,
and then they load offload.
Yeah, being towed. So you'd be looking for patterns of activity as much as you would be for somebody blasting through at 50 knots, if that's what they could do. I spent some time with a delightful chap called Victor Rossa, who was one of those guys who was poacher turned gamekeeper. So he'd done a deal. He'd done a deal to keep him and his family out of South America. Yeah. A more talented go fast operator I've never met. In fact, he took us to Cuba on a couple of occasions for lunch under the auspices of let's go and see what the boat can do. So I've been to Cuba twice, but I've never actually got my passport out. But yeah, a great guy, very talented bloke. But again, understanding the rationale of the crews. If your family is being held or they're under threat, then your motivation to get through at any cost is high.
Absolutely.
There's the backstories to most of this is as heartbreaking as the resultant deliveries going to the street. Hence
what I was saying before about Mexico, and you can push that down everywhere else.
Yeah.
Because what I saw there, what I understand, and to be fair, it's the same in terror and in other areas. At the end of the day, if you get yourself involved for whatever reason, and there may be pressing and good reasons to involve yourself, or it may just be the thing that's done. The big problem is that it's not just you. It then reflects to the whole of your family. And I used to hear a lot of people talk about Colombian narco police example and say, oh, they're corrupt and this and that and the other. But what do you do if a fellow walks into a police station full of, 300 well-armed officers and walks up to the chief and says, it's your choice, my friend. It's the silver or the lead. And he's serious. And he's serious. It's not as though he's just pretending,
Yes, he's not there. He's not there for the good of his health. Yeah.
Exactly. And he means all your family. He's not just meaning you. It's very difficult. So it's easy for people to turn around and say, oh, they're corrupt. But why? What is their choice?
I think that's something certainly in the UK, given our the modern day, our perceived level of choice is so vast. We don't really know how lucky we are.
Correct.
And there are so many other people in not so far-flung parts of the world who really don't have that level of choice. I think that's almost to my eternal shame. You don't know what you've got till you've lost it, but really, we do take an awful lot for granted.
Correct, absolutely correct. And so when I hear about these guys who are not in the trade, right?
Yeah.
So now I'm being a little bit provocative here, but when you figure that the vast majority of politicians know exactly what's going down, and let's say, to not defame it, could well be in pay in these particular lands. Why should police, why should naval individuals, why should other judicial individuals not involve themselves? It's very difficult because
it's a smart question. It's a huge question. We're starting to get to the core of human nature, and then I don't want to lift the lid on that. Why did I? Let me put it this way. Why did I enjoy this particular part of my career so much? It's because I guess naively I thought, even if you make just a small difference and you stop one shipment getting through, that's a small win. And somewhere then somebody doesn't get their cocaine that day, and it is naive looking back, but it's a point of honor. I guess ultimately I just wanted to be certain that I was one of the good guys. And I realized that in itself is a movable feast.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I'm not even saying, excuse me, I'm not even saying it's naive. My perspective is on this whole thing, having looked at, when I was looking at Colombia, was from the perspective of narco-terrorism. I mean, at the time, the Medellin cartel, obviously, the famous Pablo, had gone crazy and had basically attacked the state of Colombia. So that's where the problem lay. Probably because he couldn't get in. Because no, it's true.
I'm with you 100%.
The guy couldn't get in. He was paying all the politicians, but they wouldn't let him in the club. And so therefore he was basically saying, well, you won't let me in the club, I'll burn the club down. That's been basic, but that's basically what it was. So had they have said to him, okay, mate, you can be a senator, as he was for a short period of time, because he liked that, and then he was, and then they threw him out when they found he'd had an arrest back in the day. Had they have just kept it, probably just keep running. My argument with that whole thing is look, I've never taken a drug in my life. I've never had a cigarette on my lips in my life, and at one stage I never drank in my life. I know that sounds like I'm a sad guy, but that was
not a bit of it. I completely identify with having had friends who dabbled in weed and tablets and various other things, and one of my kids had a brush with that over lockdown. Then it's just not me.
Exactly. That's the thing.
I just. It's not that I don't get the attraction for people. I do, but it's just I just don't see it as ultimately there's enormous harm there. I mean, I completely applaud the non-smoking. I have smoked for a little bit, but not much. I now occasionally enjoy a good Cuban, but at 30, 40 quid a pop, obviously that's not something I've got time for every day. But it just I just don't get it. Like the closest, the brush with one of my kids getting into the wrong crowd at college over the last couple of years has been an eye-opener for me, because suddenly it's in my face on my doorstep.
Yep.
That was a real homecoming for me personally, because suddenly there was no ROE, there was no set of rules. I was not in control, and that was an education which I'm touching wood. I think we're through now.
Do you know what I came to, Fraser, from looking at narco-terrorism? Because obviously my drugs were not my baby, other than when I actually worked for the American, because we had a lot of drugs being run about when I was a detective for them. But in the branch and in SIS, drugs were not my baby. It was how it went into terror, or the routes they used or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
But my point with it was actually just legalize the damn thing, right? Because I couldn't see how you can fight it. Literally, I couldn't see how you can fight it.
It's like trying to, the so-called war on terror and Muslim fundamentalism. How can you beat an enemy who doesn't mind dying?
Absolutely.
At the point where you regulate it and you control it and you can be certain of quality, then it's like legalizing areas for sex workers. It's going to happen anyway.
Absolutely.
But at least at that point, they can be safe, they can be healthy, they don't get killed or abused. There's so many parallels.
We're singing from the same hymn sheet, my friend.
Sorry, mate. I've got on my soapbox there for a second.
No, but you're right, because we're singing from the same hymn for all of these points. We put up a moral perspective, and then let's be realistic again. Most of the people that were pushing for that moral perspective, we call them politicians, are actually going against it in one way, shape, or means, which we see with Partygate. So that's me now being absolutely.
It's for me though, and this is I think it's important. I say this now. You mentioned about not being naive. Ultimately, if I pare all this away, it's about what I think of the guy that I see in the mirror. It's about actually, since my parents are long gone, bless them both, am I doing the right thing? Am I upholding the kind of values and traditions that they instilled?
Yes.
Would I be able to face them if they, just happen to pop round the corner and say, "Oh, actually, it was all the big." I'm actually alive. It really is about that kind of. I guess one of my kids is a Royal Marine Commando, and the values by which they live, I think, could be chosen for the whole world.
Yep.
That humility, integrity, all the other all those basic core values. You know, can you live with yourself? Are you doing the right thing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe if we all asked we asked ourselves that every day, the whole planet might be a better place.
It would be, but we'd have to share out the goods, wouldn't we? And that's where the problem lies.
True.
Naturally we're not sharing the goods out. Now, everybody can only do for their personal thing. I would never want to be bought by a drugs person or by another state or whatever. That would be what I would hate. So that's why I just wouldn't do it, because I'd hate to be bought. I'd hate to be bought.
You've lost everything.
Yeah, I'd hate to be bought. So that's my perspective to it. I'm not calling somebody else down. I'm just saying, look at the bigger picture. So, you know, in dealing with that, I've always found in dealing in my game, you know, a lot of it's turning people into agents, or was in the past. And by that, I mean, in the intelligence world, secret intelligence world, that's what we call informants and stuff, for the greater good, as we perceive it. And it may not be the greater good, but we think it is.
Why does that always remind me of Hot Fuzz?
You know, so you see, what I'm trying to do is trying to understand the fella or the woman in doing it. If you can't understand a person, if you can't understand why, I don't know, top of my head, we United Kingdom people, if you can't understand why a Catholic person in the Bogside in 1968 doesn't think they've got a raw deal, then you're never going to change anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
They clearly have got a raw deal, and you've got to see it for what it is. You know, so now the question is, can you change that before it falls over that precipice and ends up in naked violence? And they provide tacit support. Now, that's the point, you see. They're maybe not the one out, you know, shooting people, laying the bombs down, but they're giving the support, because otherwise they can't function. The others who are willing to do the act cannot function.
Yeah.
And so you have to take that reasoning for that action away.
Well, let me just, you know, I'm sorry, I'm getting, my gyros are spinning up at the moment, because there's so much that you're saying that I just, you know, I'm really getting fired up. So let me sort of loop this back to the final few pages of your book. Here, I've got it in front of me actually, but your Black Ops book, which I very much enjoyed for a variety of reasons, which again I could go into at length, but won't. But I think if the level of understanding in your own forces, in your own organisations, and that's highlighted in your final few pages, where you quietly, you know, elect through loyalty not to challenge publicly, but to settle out of court. Yeah. If that level of understanding is as it is among our top tier operators and politicians and police officers and military, then we kind of, well, as my mother used to say, knackered before you're out the front door.
I like you, mother.
You know, if your own people can't understand, you know, institutional racism, can't understand asymmetry in their own people, then where do you go?
Absolutely.
You know, I read that with kind of acceptance and horror. You know, yeah, that makes sense to me. No, I don't get that. Why does it make any particular difference? The fact that, you know, you mentioned a northern mill town, which I will get out of you at some point, but I was born in Col, and that kind of instantly put me on okay, I think I'll understand this guy then, because he's a little bit older than me, but I'm starting to identify with him as an individual. I don't know him, but I'm starting to knit a little bit of a picture together. Yeah. So if your own people don't understand themselves, how is it possible we can profess to understand the wider picture of other people? Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, that really hit me hard.
No, and I think it's great to hear it because if I look at that, I mean, the people who I call my grandparents were obviously my real grandparents, who I'd never seen and only saw one in my life many years later, were in the Caribbean. But the people I call my grandparents were basically Lancastrians who actually spoke Lancashire dialect. Couldn't speak standard English, as you know. You know, I'm telling people, they don't understand that. When you go back in those times, because the BBC wasn't all omnipotent and the TV wasn't everywhere, people spoke in dialect. So they even spoke differently. and that showed itself in class. So the higher you went up the class, the more they spoke, for people listening.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I used to have trouble with my my maternal grandmother, my nana as she was, because having spent all her career in the mills and had a sort of stooped back because of it, I could get nothing past that woman because she'd been lip reading for decades. So even if I was turning away at the oblique, she'd be able to tell what I was saying. So nothing got past her. Interestingly, my sister has accused me at various points in my life of having a plumbing accent. My accent is sort of world service military radio chat.
Yes,
that's all it is. So it's not been kicked out of me as much as sort of polished out, maybe.
Yes.
But there are times when I go up to Lancashire where I do start to to the Dibner, as it is, and you know what? I've no issue with that. I like where I come from. And it's funny.
You see, because to me, what I find interesting with that is that what we did in the UK to some extent was, unless you were, and this struck me straight away when you said you had to be an officer for whatever reason, and you were saying what was the reason behind that, but what tended to happen was that unless you basically left the United Kingdom and went to the colonies or somewhere where you could then be an honorary, well, I don't want to use ruling class as a word, an honorary higher class individual. Let's use that. I don't want to put these sort of Marxist aspect on it, but an honorary upper class person. You had talents and skills which were never utilized. It's people. It's like in the First World War. People don't understand that in the First World War, the average British individual fighting that war, and if you want stats, it's something like 2/3, didn't have a right to vote.
No,
people assume that all the men were voting. They were not. You had to be a property owning individual to vote. And again, the other factor which people don't understand is the suffragette movement. It was not seeking votes for all women. It was seeking votes for women of the upper class, the same way as men had it. Right?
Yes.
So that's, unless you understand that history, we are hiding.
This goes back to your point though about the number of West Indians, the number of Africans, the number of other racial groups who fought during the Second World War.
Absolutely.
Now, apart from the somewhat recent film of the Red Tails, which I absolutely adore, or dramatised though it is.
Yeah, over-dramatised. Yeah.
Not another single film is there about
correct
the contribution. It just kind of, I think even Bomber Command, which was largely why it had to fight for a memorial recently to get something in London. So none of it makes sense. No, people seem to forget the basic facts.
Correct.
Which is astonishing to me, really.
And so I'm an inclusive guy, and that's what I like. I like inclusivity, but I like the truth. I'm a truth guy. So let's tell what the truth is so we can all see it. And then let's try and work in unison. And so that's basically what this has been about. And I wanted you on because I wanted to understand the interdiction, which we can go just a little bit further into. Unfortunately, we've run so long, and we tend to do this on the show. But I just want to go on a little bit at what happened after interdiction and what you were doing then thereafter. But what I also wanted you on for was because I understood this thing of a chap coming from where you came from, fighting his way through to get into an elite body that sometimes too often looked at things from the perspective of who should get something rather than what a person's capacity is. I know the Navy didn't tend to do that, and I always loved the fact that captains of the Navy could come from anywhere, because actually if you couldn't work out where you were on the high seas, you were no good. So, no matter how plummy your accent was, like in the army, you could
down to skill.
You had to have skills, and that's fantastic. I just love it when you have to work from skills rather than anything else.
Certainly, as part of a Nimrod crew, if you've ever worked as part of a team and you experienced that moment when the team truly gels, and it's a point in time, it's a point in an operation where you feel the wheels mesh, you feel all the
Brilliant.
cogs in the machine mesh at the same time. So I'd only ever experienced that on a rugby field of 15 players before.
Mhm.
But being when I left operational flying from Nimrods, I was a nav captain on 120 Squadron, and we had a few operations there.
Sorry,
where
what
I
is
felt
120 Squadron, Fraser?
120 Squadron. It's one of the squadrons in the RAF. So I spent some time on 201, Guernsey's own squadron, which was flying Nimrods, and then I went across to. I wanted captaincy.
Yep.
I was told by my then boss, who, interestingly, about sort of 18 months later, when we were doing test flying, said, "Oh, I really should have promoted you to a captain." At which point I said, "Well, no, it's no bloody good telling me that now, is it?" I think I was a bit more gracious about it than that, but that's what I thought. But I was told that there were old guys coming back through the system, and I was going to have to fight for my crust. So I looked across and said, "Well, 120 short captains. Why can't I go there then?" So I did a deal with my postings officer, and then went and told my squadron boss, which, as you can imagine, impressed the hell out of him. But he kind of gave me a set of circumstances I had to do something with. So I went across to 120, but that my crew 5 on 120 were just the most, I know they're my guys, but they were just utterly phenomenal operators.
Brilliant.
Each. But that whole working as a team, getting the right job done was superb.
Yeah, and the book stopping with you. You showing the design, you showing the desire, you if you will, shining the path. Which I think
that was the best thing, because at the time there were no other aircraft captain that were not pilots in the world.
Right.
So Nimrods would have air electronics officers or pilots or navigators as the aircraft captain. Nowadays there's an aircraft commander and there's a mission commander, which is right.
Oh, I see.
But at the time, you signed the aircraft 700, which is the legal log.
Mm-hmm.
And once you'd done that, it didn't matter if whatever higher power you believe in came up the aircraft steps, you were still the ranking officer. So It was bat, ball, stumps, pitch. And I used to love that. But again, it was not possible without the achievement, the success of it. It wasn't possible without the other 14 guys. And I knew that. And they knew that, and that it goes back to the understanding. Ultimately, I depended on them to make sure we got it right, and the loyalty of that worked both up and down. I had the best time with them. They were absolutely superb.
Fantastic. Fraser, we've gone an hour and a half, but I don't know, great, and I don't want to two-part it because it's just flowing so well. Last thing, you went into links. How did that happen?
We were doing maritime counter-terrorism with the Navy and the SBS. Mm-hmm. And essentially at that point, there were two types of Nimrod crew. There would be those standard crews that would be able to do the surveillance element of the operation. Mm-hmm. And there were then special MCT crews. There were 9 crews on each squadron, and 3 of those crews were MCT qualified, which meant you could then operate with swimmers, ribs, helicopters.
Got you.
So you do the take. You
so for the interdiction, for the actual
the takedown phase,
yeah.
And at the time, there was sort of I just cottoned on to a bit of background laughter from various people that we weren't up to much, and that upset me because I thought, well, we're doing our best.
So who was this? Who was saying you weren't up to much?
Especially the guys on the surface,
right?
Now, I mean, maybe I'm sort of getting off topic, but ultimately I spent some time with the guys on the surface working the ribs mm-hmm. with a number of other colleagues because it upset me that we weren't hacking it for them.
Got you. Okay. So you weren't providing what they needed in order to interdict.
And much of that was that we couldn't because we didn't understand their world.
Got you.
So if we don't understand what they want, how can we provide it? And some of their kit didn't allow us to provide it. So the whole series of factors.
Can you just explain very quickly, because again, how you would interdict? So you got a drugs run going through. You want to actually do the pointy bit and jump on the boat with these guys. Weapons drawn, bang, 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 because they're going to put attacks in sometimes. So can you explain how that kind of functions? So you've got special forces. You've got SBS, which is Special Boat Service, which is the naval version of the Special Air Service. So they're doing the pointy bit. You've got the Navy. How does it all come together? Can you explain that?
Yeah, ultimately, be it a moving vessel, an oil and gas installation, but basically you've got a platform controlled by undesirables, and you want to put your own guys on there and regain control.
Right. Right. So we're talking counter-terrorism rather than narcotics now. Yeah, I'm with you. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter what sort of frame you put around it. Ultimately, we have an asset that's ours. Yeah. Somebody's taken control of that asset, and we want to wrest it back from them.
Yes.
So ultimately, being at sea, people are going to come from only one of two places. They're going to come from the water, or they're going to come from the air.
Yeah.
So we would work with Lynx. We would work with Mark 4 Sea Kings, the troop carriers, to be able to run in. The four leading aircraft would suppress.
Yeah.
And then essentially you would coordinate a surface and air attack on this platform.
Yes.
I won't go into any of the details because I can't imagine. Given the physics of it, nothing will have changed unless we've got
absolutely.
Time traveling devices. But
no, what's sensitive? We won't go there.
I like the idea of the jetpacks they've been trialing. They look enormous fun, but I don't know whether you can actually wield a weapon and fly them.
Fly at the same time. Yeah. I think it's been tried since the 60s, hasn't it? But
yeah.
If it works or not, I don't know. But so that's beautiful. So listeners can get a view of that. So what you basically have is all the forces coming together, but you need is a command and control area above to be able to say this and this and this might well be an area. You've
got various radio nets, but multi different helicopter platforms, surface assets that are in boats, some that are not in boats, and the idea is that while everybody knows what everybody's doing, ultimately the Nimrod would vector the surface ribs onto the target to such point they could gain visual, and at that point it would be hands off. We'll leave it to you.
Yeah, got you. Yeah,
that's we're talking. Most people think, oh, okay, well it'll only be one vessel on its own. Well, it might not be. They might be in a shipping lane.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. So that in itself is an exciting task and role. So you've left.
Interesting. Yeah.
You've left because your time was up. You needed to leave, or you chose to leave.
I had a bit of a fallout with one of my squadron execs, which I won't go into. And basically, he gave me a choice. That I'd been at Kinross too long. I needed to go and do something else that was challenging. I wasn't going to get promotion that I wanted. I wanted to become an examiner. That wasn't on the cards. So I went into flight test and trial.
This is what I wanted to get to. Yeah.
Yeah. So we would then look at new kit. We'd look at software upgrades, kit upgrades, and we'd basically go and work between industry and the military to get the best possible capability for any perceived threat, or upgrade the systems that we had to answer that threat.
And how do we stand, Fraser? Because obviously we're buying American kit because we've got the new F-22s on the aircraft carrier on the Queen Elizabeth.
Well, we just bought a series of P-8 Poseidon aircraft, which are essentially the 737s, not the Max, I hasten to add.
Okay.
That would have been interesting had they been so cheap. We'd have had to ask that, I think. But essentially, I think they've got maybe 3 or 4 of a planned 9, which is flying out of RAF Lossiemouth, but they are the new fixed-wing patrol aircraft.
Yeah. See, my question was, you were doing this and testing the kit. Is it you testing US kit and adding British aspects to it, or is this British kit you were testing?
It was British kit at the time.
Right.
We still have Mark 2 Nimrods. The Mark 4 Nimrod was up and coming. Obviously, that was bulldozed by Mr. Cameron. I'll keep the emotional issues out of that for the time being. But that would have been a hell of a capability, but it was, decades overdue and billions over budget.
So probably the right move.
I can't fault him. It hurts, but I can't fault the logic. The logic's there.
Yeah.
But no, we were testing British kits, and again, the pride of that some of the quality of the engineering on the Nimrod meant that with some smart software, we could do all sorts of things with the kit that it was just never designed to do.
Yeah.
As for the new, it's a good argument you make. We're American kit. I think once you subscribe to Sky, as I call it, you're kind of on a bound. That's it. You get the packages you pay for.
Right.
But if the Americans don't want to give you this or don't want to give you their full capability, then they're not going to.
But can we upgrade it though? That was the interesting thing I was trying to get from you. Can we upgrade if they say, oh well, this is obviously they're going to keep their top kit for themselves. That's obvious, is to make any sense otherwise. But can we not say, right, this is where we are, we can upgrade this to a better level? Is that possible or is it not?
I think that there will be agreements in place where we can essentially operate the platform but develop some of our own kit and systems. I genuinely don't know. I'm sort of speaking from experience of having worked with other systems.
Yes.
But it's likely that we'll be able to have our own say on it. But at the end of the day, it's an American platform with American systems.
Yeah.
And the Americans are masters at this. They sold F-16s and C-130s and various things around the world.
Yeah.
And the world quite likes American kit because it generally does what it says on the tin.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. Yeah, so now you're living a nice and quiet life. And how did you find that? How did you find leaving the military?
I think certainly doing the flight test was great. Because we were working with industry. Mm-hmm. So I bumped into a lot of previous bosses who had come to retire and then been seconded to industry as, quote, business development managers.
Right. Okay.
That's where I bumped into the boss who said he should have given me captaincy, which it was a nice lunch, Andy. Thank you. Other than that, it was I was then looking really at the end of my term and approaching 38 and looking for promotion. Now, before I left the OEU, I got what I thought was a golden ticket project. So I worked with Director Special Forces, who basically gave me a one-way channel to him and a checkbook and said, I want 4 of a particular system on these particular aircraft. Can you do it in 10 weeks? And I said 12, and he said 10 or not at all. You know how it is. You can't negotiate with terrorists. You certainly don't negotiate with special forces.
Absolutely.
So I had a dream project. I brought it through in fine style. It surpassed all expectation.
Fantastic.
And I thought that's my ticket for promotion. That's got to be the perfect shot at the perfect time. When I was told otherwise, and I didn't get the recommendations out of that I thought I should have. At that point, I thought, okay, we're coming up to the end of your initial permanent commission. Mm-hmm. The options then are either to continue as specialist aircrew, which is basically all you do is fly.
Yeah.
And I'd kind of done everything I wanted to do. So there was nothing that was really going to excite me, other than a change of aircraft. But then obviously we've got a whole load of other navigators and they weren't going to take me fast jet at that stage. Mm. So it was that, or go and do something else and perhaps prove to myself that I could live outside the institution.
Yes.
So that was what I went with. I was very angry at not having been my loyalty and my energy and my input not having borne fruit. Mm-hmm. So I thought perhaps we should go and do something else and prove that I wasn't a one-trick pony.
Yeah. And have you looked back? Did you not two last questions? One, did you miss it? And 2, have you looked back, or has it been, great for you having left?
It's been a challenge. I am still my thinking is still innately military.
I don't think you'll lose that.
No, I don't think I will. I don't necessarily think I want to use that, but I'm trying to sort of perhaps every day trying to evolve into something better, if not only for myself, but for my wife, my family around me. But I do think there are certain things you can take forward that you can, say to your kids and your family and try and teach them that actually it doesn't matter how the world changes. Ultimately, there's still right, wrong, up, down, left, right. The same set of qualities apply.
Yeah.
I miss the flying every day, but I miss the flying not for the sake of flying, not for the sake of getting airborne, but for the sake of going to do a job to achieve an aim.
Yes.
And I miss the characters and the camaraderie enormously.
Yeah.
Although somewhat perversely, I think I mentioned that, maybe there were times in my career when I thought perhaps I may have made the wrong choice in terms of what I joined.
Yes, you did say that. Yeah.
Most of my enduring contacts are from Poole,
right,
and,
okay.
and the Royal Marines and the boat troop.
Mm.
I have a few close friends from flying, but nowhere near as many as I still talk to from the surface lad. Yeah. So it's perhaps a bit strange, but there's some superb characters, some absolute stars that really graced my life as I went through it, and I miss that. But the politics and the squabbling and the infighting and some of the sort of less desirable things that I thought then and still think get in the way of being focused to an objective. I don't miss that at all.
No, absolutely.
I still abhor that. I have friends who are still working in various sort of senior and air ranks, and I don't think they like it either.
No,
but I think obviously they're in it, so they've got to live in it.
I think that's the problem with a lot of services, regardless of what it is. I think that happens, but yeah. Fraser, well, listen, thank you very much. That has been absolutely fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard from a man who has worked his way up, down, around, across the world, doing interesting things. Obviously, he's only given us a taste of what he did. Certain things he cannot say, quite rightly. We never push anybody on the show to venture into an area that's unsafe for our present day colleagues. So I want to stress that. But listen, Fraser, thank you very much for today.
No, sincere thanks. A humbling experience, but thank you very much indeed for speaking with me and having me on the show, Carlton. I'm very grateful to you.
I fear we've only got halfway through, not really what you did, but of what you have to offer and what you've seen in your concepts of life. And so maybe next time we'll just have a sit down and a discussion. Maybe we can bring you back on in a couple of seasons' time, if that would be something you would do.
If I can be of service to you, my friend, I'm here.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And we'll see you, in fact, hear you, or you'll hear us again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.